Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please...
First question is from Mary Fee.
To ask the Scottish Government when the Transport Secretary last met bus operators that serve Renfrewshire.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
I last met with Stagecoach on the 5th of February 2019. I also met with First Bus on the 26th of November 2018.
Mary Fee.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? McGill's Buses, the main operator running as a monopoly in many parts of Renfrewshire, have recently announced changes to services, such as axing the 907 linking Glasgow and Renfrewshire to Dunoon, and originally proposing increases of up to 62% for fares on peak time journeys between Erskine and Glasgow. The company have since backtracked and proposed fares increases of up to 30%, with local MSP Derek Mackay championing this increase as a win for passengers. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that extortionate fare increases are only a win for bus operators and shows the need for regulating the bus industry across Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I know from the discussions I've had with Derek Mackay that he was concerned about the increases that were being proposed by McGill's on some of their particular routes, and I know that he's been making strenuous representations to them in order to address that. And I do welcome the fact that McGill's have sought to reduce the level of increase that they were proposing. The member will also be aware that within the Transport Bill we have set out a range of options in order to help to strengthen the role that local authorities can have in how bus services are provided within their area, including that of bus service improvement partnerships, in order to ensure that there's a greater recognition of local need within the way in which bus operators provide bus services. And those measures, I believe, will help to strengthen the way in which we can ensure that bus services are delivered within local communities in a way which reflect their needs, and I hope that the Labour Party will support that when it comes before Parliament.
And Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I add my concerns to some of those price increases in the west of Scotland? But the Minister talks about the potential of the Transport Bill to address some of these issues around local authorities setting up franchises. I haven't met a single local authority that's interested in doing this, or indeed will have any money to do this. Can the Transport Secretary tell us how many local authorities have expressed interest to him in able to actually set up these local bus franchises?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, the member seems to try to characterise this as though franchising is the only element which has been provided within the bill. As a member of the committee that's considering this legislation, we're aware there's a range of measures which are being provided within the bill to allow local authorities a range of different options that are not available to them at the present moment. And as also been suggested to me by the committee, it may be that we should add further options to the bill, and that's something which we're giving active consideration to, and we'll consider that at stage 2. So I think it's important that the member doesn't characterise the bill as actually offering only one option. It offers a suite of options to local authorities to consider what best meets the needs within their local communities.
Question number 2, Rachael Hamilton.
To ask the Scottish Government what plans it has to forge greater links with Singapore.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
Scotland's international framework sets out how our international work supports the Scottish Government's central purpose of creating a more successful country. The Scottish Government values and appreciates the long and positive relationship we have built with Singapore, which has been an important trading partner for Scotland for many years. 2019 marks the 200th anniversary of trading between the UK and Singapore, with the arrival of Stamford Raffles and William Farquhar, who was a Scot. Scottish Development International's South East Asia office has been based in Singapore since 2001, demonstrating our commitment to a strong relationship. In fact, Scottish direct exports to Singapore went from £585 million in 2016 to £655 million in 2017, an increase of £70 million. We will continue to promote Scotland's trade capabilities in areas such as oil and gas, food and drink and renewable energy, as well as encourage inward investments in data analytics, life sciences, energy, manufacturing and tourism. We will also continue to welcome exchange between Scotland and Singapore in education and culture.
Rachael Hamilton.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and the Cabinet Secretary acknowledges the bicentenary anniversary of the founding of modern Singapore in January of 1819. Notably, two of the three main founding fathers were Scottish, Major William Farquhar and John Crawford. Given these significant historical ties, the renewed British Council NCA Singapore Memorandum of Understanding and a greater need to forge links across the world, will the Cabinet Secretary support the establishment of an MOU? Will the Cabinet Secretary support an establishment of an MOU between Creative Scotland and NCA Singapore?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'd be very pleased for an MOU between Creative Scotland and the National Arts Council of Singapore to be signed. We're welcoming 70 technology leaders from Singapore and South East Asia on the Connect Government Leaders Summit in Edinburgh this July. That's very positive. But can Rachael Hamilton not consider that it is a bit rich for the Conservatives to come to this chamber, encourage more trading links, but not leave the country to do so, not have our First Minister visit them? She's encouraging us to help support the 14th largest export partner for Scotland, but not that is the second. Our First Minister was championing Scottish business in France this week and in the US and Canada. And can she get Boris Golden to apologise for attacking our First Minister? And isn't it a bit time that we, Presiding Officer, all come together, support Scotland and our business trading partnerships, and let's make sure that our First Minister and this Parliament can fly the flag for Scotland. Yay!
Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following on from reports of cancelled trade talks with China and souring relations with Japan as a consequence of the high-handed approach of the UK Government, which has indeed been described as gunboat diplomacy, can the Cabinet Secretary outline the approach that the Scottish Government takes and how that benefits Scotland in contrast to the reckless and incompetent approach that we have seen undertaken by the UK Government?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, in that considered question, I do want to explain to Parliament that we are currently working on our Trading Nation, a plan for growing Scotland's exports, and we're expecting that to be published in spring 2019. But it is of serious concern in terms of diplomatic activity that not just the Defence Secretary, but also, very importantly, Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, have jeopardised very important trade discussions. The EU and Japan, as we know, have just signed an agreement that's come into implementation in relation to customs and exchange and exports. That's very important to business across the UK, but particularly in Scotland. And I think it's very worrying indeed that some of the cack-handed approaches that we've seen from the UK Government is symptomatic of how they're treating the Brexit situation generally. I think it's really important that we all get behind our companies at this very fragile and difficult times for our export companies, and that needs leadership from the top, and that does not need bumbling diplomacy that we've seen from the UK Government.
Question number 3, David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the importance of food banks in supporting people in receipt of universal credit.
Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell.
Thank you. Even the UK Government has finally recognised, after years of mounting evidence, that rolling out universal credit has increased the need for food banks. Universal credit has caused huge damage and pushed people into debt and hardship, and we will continue to call for no one to be migrated to universal credit until its fundamental flaws have been fixed and it works for people, not against them. Recognising that people have been badly hit by UK government welfare cuts and to protect vulnerable communities against the economic damage of Brexit, last month I announced a further £500,000 investment in FareShare, who will further support organisations that are responding to food insecurity. This is in addition to our £3.5 million Fair Food Fund to tackle food insecurity. Presiding Officer, though it is shocking, we have to take such measures because we want to reach more of the people who will need the help most.
David Torrance.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. In my constituency, Kirkcaldy Food Bank has seen a 90% increase from the period December 2017 to December 2018. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that Amber Rudd's recent acknowledgement of a link between the rollout of universal credit and the increased use of food banks is too little, too late, and that the cruel and callous actions of the UK Government has caused untold misery for thousands of families living across Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do. It is a long overdue acknowledgement from Amber Rudd, but acknowledgement alone won't help families in Fife, Scotland or the rest of the UK. And what Amber Rudd needs to now do is to act and to change this failed system, and that means reversing the benefits capped and the benefits freeze and the abhorrent rate clause. And then we can then start to see the progress which doesn't leave people reliant on food banks for that basic of need.
And Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Since the Cabinet Secretary is clearly aware of the increasing necessity of food banks, something that's frankly shocking since we shouldn't need Victorian-style charity in 21st century Scotland, does she agree that the £5 child benefit top-up that Labour have been calling for would make a big difference to many families, including those in receipt of universal credit?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that's why we're working currently on an income supplement, as the member knows. But I think what the members should also do is recognise that we need to work together to put the pressure on the UK Government to recognise the failed system of universal credit, the impeding cliff edge that many people will face if there is a no-deal exit from the EU, which will punish those with least financial resilience the most. And does she not agree that we should unite on that message, especially when we've had to announce £500,000 to prepare for Brexit, to tackle food insecurity, which we know will happen if there is a no-deal exit from the European Union? That, quite frankly, is ridiculous and is tantamount to the reckless actions of the UK Government, which will be punishing people who have least in this society the most. And that is an absolute shocking indictment of the UK's approach to welfare reforms.
Question 4, Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to modernise facilities at Kirkcaldy Sheriff Court.
Minister Ash Denham.
This question relates to operational matters that are the responsibility of the Scottish Court and Tribunal Service. The service is currently creating a two-court criminal annex within Kirkcaldy Police Station to hear sheriff and jury cases and custody hearings, and this is due to be fully operational by autumn 2019.
Jenny Gilruth.
I thank the Minister for that response, and I welcome the Scottish Courts and Tribunals Service investment of £3.7 million to modernise facilities at Kirkcaldy Sheriff Court, in line with recent recommendations from HM Inspectorate of Prisons. In the context of the new Protecting Vulnerable Witnesses legislation, is there now an opportunity for Kirkcaldy Sheriff Court to lead the way in developing a pilot suite for child witnesses to give evidence on commission with the ethos of the Barnahouse approach at its heart?
Minister.
I'm glad that the member has made mention of the Vulnerable Witnesses legislation, and I am aware of the detailed consideration that Jenny Gilruth and also her colleagues on the Justice Committee have already given the important reforms that are in this bill. In terms of investing in facilities, the Scottish Government has already provided £950,000 of funding to support the creation of new child and vulnerable witness-friendly hearing suites in Glasgow, and made another £1.1 million available to court service to upgrade other venues and also IT. As part of this upgrading work, the court service are also procuring portable recording equipment and camera operators, and that will allow some commission hearings to take place in Sheriff Court buildings across Scotland. We are exploring how the Barnahouse concept could operate in Scotland, and we have asked Healthcare Improvement Scotland and also the Care Inspectorate to develop Scotland-specific standards, which will set out a roadmap for developing our approach.
Question number 5, Angus MacDonald.
To ask the Scottish Government when it last met Falkirk Council to discuss the proposed growth deal for the district.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
My officials last met with representatives of Falkirk Council to discuss the development of their growth deal proposal on the 16th of January this year. The next meeting is scheduled for the 20th of March, when progress with the growth deal will feature on the agenda for a meeting of the Falkirk Economic Partnership. As part of our aim for 100% coverage of Scotland with growth deals, this Government fully supports Falkirk's deal proposal. We'll look to the UK Government to join us in common purpose and ensure that as much progress is made towards that goal in 2019 as possible.
Angus MacDonald.
Cabinet Secretary for his reply. I'm aware that the Leader of Falkirk Council is meeting with the Secretary of State for Scotland today to discuss the proposed growth deal, and I clearly hope for a positive outcome from these talks. Given the significant investment plans by the private sector, not least the 7 national-scale developments underway or being considered at present for Grangemouth, will the Cabinet Secretary highlight to the Secretary of State when he next meets him that the gross value added from the proposed growth deal would be in excess of £330 million across Falkirk District, and that it will set a new course locally for sustainable, inclusive growth?
Cabinet Secretary.
I will, and I will continue to highlight the potential benefits of the growth deal for the Falkirk area. When I last met with the Secretary of State for Scotland to discuss growth deals at the end of January, I asked again for the UK Government to give a formal commitment to 100% coverage of Scotland with growth deals. I am conscious that Falkirk Council is one of only 3 local authority areas that still does not have a formal commitment from the UK Government on this matter. And my view is that working in partnership with the Scottish Government to achieve that would mean that real benefits for local communities right across the Falkirk Council area could be achieved in generating the investment that Angus MacDonald has highlighted, helping to create new jobs and helping to create wider economic prosperity within the Falkirk Council area.
Alison Harris.
Thank you. As has been mentioned previously, the Secretary of State is meeting with representatives from Falkirk Council to discuss plans today, and I'm sure we all agree that the city and regional deals that thus far have gone through have been beneficial for Scotland. But can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he could just assure me that any potential growth deal in Falkirk will include the regeneration of the town centre specifically, and not just as currently is on the table going eastwards down towards Grangemouth?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I am aware that the Secretary of State for Scotland is meeting with Falkirk Council today, and I hope at the end of that meeting with Cecil Meiklejohn, the Leader of the Council, David Mundell will give a commitment on the part of the UK Government to supporting a Falkirk Council growth deal, which they have not provided to date. But the member will recognise actually that the various issues that are highlighted within a growth deal are for the partners to determine, not the Scottish Government. And the content of that growth deal is one which is shaped in partnership with the different agencies who have an interest in developing that growth deal, and is not directed by the Scottish Government. But no doubt they will be looking at a whole range of regeneration projects that can help to support and sustain the Falkirk economy going forward in the years ahead.
And question 6, Keith Brown.
To ask the Scottish Government what progress has been made on the Stirling and Clackmannanshire City Region deal.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government and its agencies are in ongoing and constructive engagement with the regional partners as we seek to progress the Stirling and Clackmannanshire City Region deal towards its final deal signing.
Keith Brown.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer and point out the investment of £45.1 million in the Scottish Government and £40.1 million in the UK Government is indeed a welcome transformative opportunity for both Clackmannanshire and Stirling. As the Cabinet Secretary will be aware, the UK Government pledged £8 million to Clackmannanshire as part of the deal to be developed collaboratively with Clackmannanshire Council and other local partners. I'd like to ask the Cabinet Secretary his view and reports that the UK Government is actively considering bids for this fund from out with the agreed formal governance structures, despite the risks to proper partnership working and the viability and sustainability of projects, and to seek the Cabinet Secretary's assurance that when considering bids for the Scottish Government funds, he will ensure the integrity of the local decision-making process is maintained.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I am aware of the concerns as they were raised with me by the Leader of Clackmannanshire Council, and I raised these very issues with the Secretary of State for Scotland when I met with him at the beginning of February. The Secretary of State has acknowledged the need to have proper governance and also assurance around the process, and he has assured me that he was dealing with the concerns which have been expressed by Kirkcaldy Council about the competing bids for projects to be funded through the Kirkcaldy Fund. My officials understand that there has been a constructive meeting now taking place between Kirkcaldy Council and the UK Government to discuss these very concerns around the Kirkcaldy Fund, and we expect to get feedback from that in the coming days. What I can assure the member of is that I am very clear that regional partners need to be at the very centre of any city deals or growth deals. Stirling and Kirkcaldy have already established a city-region deal joint committee to oversee and direct the implementation and delivery of the city-region deal, and the Scottish Government is clear that this committee has to be an integral part of any decision-making process, and that's part of the agreement which we have in place with this particular city deal, and I'll continue to assert that view as we go forward with this deal and any other deals across the country.
And Dean Lockhart.
Does the Cabinet Secretary welcome the investment of more than £45 million from the UK Government in the Stirling and Kirkcaldy City deal? And this includes £10 million for the establishment of a new national tartan centre which will create jobs and boost tourism in the Stirling region.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I welcome any investment alongside the other £45 million which has been invested by the Scottish Government, which I'm sure the member also welcomes, in order to make sure we do everything we can to help to support the regional economy within Stirling and Kirkcaldy. But equally, it's also important that that funding is utilised in a way which actually sticks to the agreement, and that is to recognise that our regional partners, particularly local authorities, are key to the decision-making and how that funding is used. And I hope that the UK Government will ensure that that process is adhered to with this particular growth deal.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. Before we move on to First Minister's questions, could I invite members to join me in welcoming to the gallery His Excellency Mr. Vegard Stroman, Ambassador of Norway. And would you also join me in welcoming to the gallery His Excellency Mr. Dan Mihalaki, Ambassador of Romania. Thank you. And before I turn to the first question, can I just advise members that I've had the opportunity to ask all the party leaders, or to be in touch with all the party leaders, to ask for shorter questions and answers this week. That will give more space for backbenchers to make contributions. I hope it will also make for snappier and more effective contributions. And I live in hope that my exhortation is adhered to. And on that note, Jackson Carlow.
Well, after that lengthy introduction, Presiding Officer, thousands of Scots every day commute across central Scotland into Edinburgh and Glasgow. Could the First Minister explain to them why a car park tax imposed on them by a local authority whose politicians they don't elect and in whose region they don't live is a good example of local decision-making?
First Minister.
Of course, this would be a discretionary power for councils, a power that under a Tory government councils in England already have, and the kind of localism that Tories have been demanding in this chamber for some time. But I noted that Jackson Carlow launched a campaign in Edinburgh this morning, and he's mentioned Edinburgh in his question, which I thought was really interesting, because you see, just a few months ago, there was a motion passed at the Transport Committee of Edinburgh City Council. It said this: to note the merits and principle of pursuing the power for Edinburgh to introduce a workplace parking levy. It was tabled by Councillor Nick Cook, Conservative, seconded by Councillor Scott Douglas, Conservative, and voted for by Councillor Graham Bruce, Conservative. Would Jackson Carlow care to explain that, how can I put this delicately, inconsistency?
Jackson Carlow.
The First Minister the First Minister wants to talk about Edinburgh City Council. Tory councillors noted the need for an economic assessment, First Minister. What the entire country has noted is that you want to impose a £500 car park tax on them with no assessment whatsoever. So, do I support a back-of-the-fag packet policy that threatens low workers with a regressive tax? No, I do not. Does the First Minister not understand what this means to ordinary people across Scotland? This is the equivalent to many people's monthly rent. So I assume from the First Minister's answer that she is now the cheerleader-in-chief for people being punished for going to work with no say, far less a vote over that decision. But the SNP's position on the car park tax is more confused than that. On Wednesday, SNP Minister Kate Forbes said this: "A key principle born of Adam Smith is that taxes should be proportionate to the ability to pay." Can the First Minister explain how this entirely admirable principle, which has so rightly inspired Kate Forbes, is even remotely met if a call centre worker earning less than £20,000 a year has to pay the same car park tax as a company director earning 5 times as much?
First Minister.
As Carlo well knows, the SNP government would not impose anything on anybody. This is a discretionary power that councils in England already have. It would be a proposed levy that councils could propose on employers, not employees. And this is what the Tories used to believe. We believe that decisions should be taken as locally as possible and that power should lie with politicians elected as locally as possible. I'm not sure when they changed their minds on that. But, you know, I've been wondering if there was a reason other than naked hypocrisy for the Tories' position on this. And I wonder if it might be something to do with this. Just at the end of last year, the Tories on Angus Council introduced car parking charges at 33 public car parks in Carnoustie, Arbroath, Forfar, Kirriemuir, Brecon and Montrose. On Eastern Bartonshire Council, the Tories last year increased car parking charges and they scrapped free parking. And in Argyll and Bute Council, the Tories imposed on car parks in Arica an 800% increase in car parking. So here we have it, Presiding Officer. The Tories don't want to give powers to councils because clearly the Tories don't trust Tory councils.
Jackson Carlo.
So it's the Henry McLeish defence. It wasn't me, it was a councillor what done it. But you are responsible, First Minister, because you and the SNP MSPs are going to vote for it this afternoon. And every single Scottish Conservative Council Group leader has now emphatically said they will not support a car park tax in their area. And every single Scottish Conservative MSP will oppose the car park tax in their constituency or region. But what about the First Minister? She's a constituency MSP in Glasgow. So what's her view? If, as a result of powers voted for by SNP MSPs, the SNP leadership of Glasgow City Council proposed charging hundreds of pounds each year for workplace parking, would she support them? Yes or no?
First Minister.
That is up to local councils to do the assessment and to make the case. That presumably is what you mean by decisions taken as locally as possible and power lying with politicians elected as locally as possible. But I just want to, get to the heart. Let's get to the heart of the Tory position here. The Tory position, as I understand it, is if the SNP government devolve a tax to councils and councils decide to use that power, that becomes an SNP government tax. So can I ask Jackson Carlo, is it the case that given that the Tory government devolved income tax powers to the Scottish Government, is the Scottish Government's use of those powers a Tory tax? Because that sounds ridiculous, but that is the logic of the Tory position. So this afternoon in the budget debate, I look forward to all of us calling the income tax decisions of this Scottish Government a Tory tax. That's the logic of Jackson Carlaw.
Jackson Carlaw.
So bluntly, it sounds as if the First Minister doesn't know if she's in favour of her own policy being imposed on her own constituents by her own SNP council. Presiding Officer, we will oppose the budget deal when it comes before Parliament this afternoon, and frankly, SNP members should too, as it breaks their own manifesto promises on both the council tax and on the basic rate of income tax. As we learned earlier this week, it risks precious tax revenue, which pays for our schools and hospitals being lost to Scotland as people take their money elsewhere. And worst of all, it is a tax that says to people across this country, trying to do the right thing, trying to juggle school drop-offs with work, trying to keep Scotland going, and in many cases working unsociable hours when there is no public transport provision, that they are to be punished. All week we've seen SNP ministers desperately distance themselves from the car park tax, and now even the First Minister won't say whether she backs it or not. It's a simple question. If they don't back it, why should anybody? Why should we?
First Minister.
I back councils having the power to decide, because we don't just preach localism and empowering councils, we practice that principle. A discretionary power that councils could use to help tackle pollution, cut emissions and, yes, invest in public transport. And I say again, Presiding Officer, exactly the localism that Tories have been demanding and exactly the power that a UK Tory government allows councils in England to already have. Isn't it the case, Presiding Officer, that I've got a wealth of evidence, I've gone through some of it here today, that the Tories do not oppose giving this power to councils in principle. They only actually oppose it when it is the SNP proposing it. It is, Presiding Officer, to coin a phrase, hypocrisy on stilts. And I hope that Jackson Carlaw had more success when he used to sell second-hand cars than he'll have in peddling that line.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard. Richard Leonard, order please.
Presiding Officer, just yesterday, school pupils across Argyll and Bute took to the streets to protest against cuts to local youth services. They understand the impact that £230 million worth of cuts to Scotland's councils will mean. Does the First Minister?
First Minister.
Well, as we saw last week, I always applaud young people taking an interest in the decisions that affect their lives, and that applies to young people in Argyll and Bute as it does to young people campaigning for greater action on climate change. But Richard Leonard is just wrong when he talks about cuts to the local government budget. This afternoon, in the budget, we will propose a budget that increases the resources that councils have to spend. We will ensure that councils have more resources in revenue terms, more resources in capital terms, more resources overall, and in addition to that, we will give councils, as we've just been debating, more flexibility in the revenue that they raise. I think that's a good thing, and I think it's incumbent on Richard Leonard, when he didn't bring forward a single proposal for any changes to the budget, to say why he will vote against that this afternoon.
Richard Leonard.
The First Minister talks about more resources for Scotland's councils. So let's examine what more resources for Scotland's councils looks like on the ground. Later today, SNP-run Dundee Council will propose a budget which will cut children's education in the city. That will mean cutting education resource workers, cutting pupil support workers, cutting primary and early years assistants, even cutting 26 teaching posts from the city's primary schools. All of this at a time when school rolls in the city are rising. So can the First Minister explain why she stands up in this chamber claiming that education is her top priority and then sets a budget that out in the real world means cuts to teachers and cuts to education?
First Minister.
Well, yet again give Richard Leonard the facts. The budget proposed that Parliament will vote on this afternoon increases local government day-to-day spending for local revenue services, including education, of £287.5 million, an increase in capital spending of £207.6 million, and greater flexibility to raise revenue. Those are the facts. But I'll give Richard Leonard
Order,
a
please.
final
Let's listen to the First
opportunity.
Minister. Order, please.
The final vote on the budget will take place at 5 o'clock today, so he's still got a few hours. If he wants us to spend more on local government, which line in the budget should we take that money from? Should it be health? Should it be social care? I'm waiting. He's got the opportunity now to do it. Let's hear what his proposal is.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, here's a fact. It's not just Dundee where cuts to council funding are hitting children's education. In SNP-run Clackmannanshire, Scottish Government cuts are so deep that council officers propose closing both Coles Norton and Fishcross primary schools. Only a campaign led by parents stopped them. But children in Clackmannanshire still face cuts. School transport is being axed. Class sizes are being increased, and 2.5 hours is being cut from the school week. Nicola Sturgeon came into office promising to cut class sizes, but 12 years on, too many children will be in bigger classes because of her budget, and they will be spending less time being taught in those classes because of her budget. First Minister, if education is your defining mission, and young people are your sacred responsibility, why are you imposing £230 million worth of cuts on Scotland's councils?
First Minister.
Well, to put it bluntly, we are not. But, you know, I guess if we wound the clock back to round about this time last year, Richard Leonard would be standing up again claiming that education budgets across the country were going to be cut. Here's what happened in this financial year. Local authorities set education budgets this year that were 3.8% higher than the budgets they set the year before. That's a 2.3% real terms increase in their planned spend on education. So those are the facts, and no matter how hard Richard Leonard tries, he cannot negate those facts. But again, you know, one last chance before 5 o'clock today. If he wants us to spend more on local government, he has an opportunity to come forward and say where that will come from. The only proposal that came from Labour benches was ruled out by Richard Leonard. He's got no credibility in asking for more money if he won't say where that money is going to come from.
Thank you very much. We've got a number of constituency questions. The first from David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, Angus Laundry announced the closure of its factory in Kirkcaldy by the beginning of April, with an anticipated loss of 86 jobs. Can the First Minister please advise what the Scottish Government can do to support employees facing redundancy?
First Minister.
Well, I was very concerned that Ellis Laundry has announced the closure of its factory in Kirkcaldy with the potential loss of many jobs. I understand that the proposal is that the site will close at the end of March and the business will transfer to Inshinnan. The PACE partnership has already engaged with Ellis Laundry and has worked with the employees affected over recent weeks, and I can assure David Torrance that the partnership will continue to provide the support that employees need to help them at this very difficult time.
Murdo Fraser, to be followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A constituent in Highland Perthshire has asked me to raise concerns about ambulance cover in the area. On the 20th of January, a 999 call for an ambulance in a life-threatening situation. It took 1 hour and 46 minutes for a rapid response unit to attend and 2 hours and 14 minutes for an ambulance to follow up. Fortunately, the patient in question has recovered, but does the First Minister consider that these timescales are acceptable, and what steps will be taken to improve the level of ambulance cover in rural Perthshire?
First Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to Murdo Fraser for raising that. Can he please pass my good wishes back to his constituent? Our ambulance service does an excellent job, and I'm sure members across the chamber would want to recognise that. I don't know all of the details of this particular case. Certainly from what Murdo Fraser has narrated, that kind of response time does not appear to me to be acceptable. However, I will ask the Health Secretary to look into the circumstances, to discuss them with the Scottish Ambulance Service, and to write to Murdo Fraser when she has more information.
Monica Lennon, to be followed by Brian Whittle.
First Minister, after the clinical waste company Healthcare Environmental Services Limited ceased its services to the NHS, boards continued to pay the company, and it has been reported that boards still owe HES £450,000. Meanwhile, HES workers still haven't been paid their final wages after they were let go at Christmas. Does the First Minister agree with me that any outstanding payments from the NHS boards to HES should be used to create a special fund for HES staff who cannot afford to be out of pocket any longer?
First Minister.
Well, can I say to Monica Lennon, firstly, I understand the sentiment behind her question, and I think we would all share the sense of anger when any employees are treated less than ideally, which is certainly the case here. On the issue of the payments, my understanding is that any payments that were made to this company were for services that had already been delivered before the companies went into its administration, and therefore health boards were contractually, legally obliged to make those payments. And I'm sure Monica Lennon can understand that position. We will continue to do everything we can, though, to help the employees concerned, and the Health Secretary, I'm sure, would be happy to talk to Monica Lennon further about the further actions the Scottish Government is able to take.
Brian Whittle, to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if I could draw the First Minister's attention to Bolton landfill site, which has now gone 250 days since the company that was running that site went into liquidation. And since then, pumps have been switched off and there's been no flaring, and there's increasing evidence of contaminants leaching into the ground and into the air and into the water. And at a recent stakeholders meeting, it was unclear where the responsibility lay for that health and safety. And I wonder if I get the opportunity, if the First Minister could tell me where those lines of responsibility lie in keeping that site safe.
First Minister.
I'm not able to give all of that information to Brian Whittle right now. I will undertake to raise this with the Environment Secretary and to come back to him as quickly as possible about our understanding of where lines of accountability are, and also the action the Scottish Government can take to try to reach a resolution of what certainly seems to be a deeply unsatisfactory situation. I can understand that people in the local area will be very concerned about any prospect of contamination, and it is absolutely necessary that all relevant agencies and organisations respond as quickly as possible.
And Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A woman in Caithness has bravely shared her experience of giving birth under the current maternity provisions there. She was pregnant with twins when she went into labour at 30 weeks. She went to the Caithness General Hospital to be told after examination that she would be transferred by road to Inverness, over 100 miles away and a 2.5-hour drive. Halfway into that journey, they had to stop at a community hospital in Golspie, where the first twin was born, Breach. The air ambulance was then tasked, but because it would take 2 hours to arrive, the first twin would be sent by road to Inverness. The helicopter could not land. Another air ambulance was tasked, but this would take too long. Therefore, a second ambulance resumed the journey to Inverness, where the second twin was born. Thankfully, after a prolonged stay in hospital, all are now doing well. However, it begs the question, why was the air ambulance or emergency retrieval team not tasked initially airlifting the mum from Caithness? Will the First Minister investigate this, and will she make sure that the air ambulance treats situations like this as a priority?
First Minister.
Yes, I will investigate that specific question, and firstly can I ask Rhoda Grant to convey my good wishes to the family in her constituency. As Rhoda Grant knows, mothers about to give birth would be transferred from Caithness only when that was considered to be in line with patient safety. Why the air ambulance wasn't immediately tasked in this case is not something I have the information on now in the chamber, but I will ask the Health Secretary to look into that this afternoon and come back to Rhoda Grant, both with an explanation of that, but also any further consideration that we think is required in light of that to ensure that where possible the right method of transferring mothers is tasked at the earliest possible opportunity.
Thank you. Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
New information suggests that John Yule could have survived if the police had responded to an emergency call in time. But we know both he and Lamara Bell died when they were left at the side of the M9 motorway for 3 days. The accident happened 4 years ago, but there is still no fatal accident inquiry. And they are not alone. Our research has found that families across Scotland wait for up to 8 years for a fatal accident inquiry into the death of their loved ones. Can the First Minister tell these families why on earth it is taking so long for them to get the answers that they deserve?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Willie Rennie for raising this issue? I would take the opportunity, given that he had raised this issue, of once again placing on the record my deepest sympathies to the families of John Yule and Lamara Bell. What happened in that case was unacceptable. There has been a great deal of investigation and lessons learned that will be applied for the future. On the specific issue of fatal accident inquiries, and I absolutely understand the frustration that families will often feel about the length of time for fatal accident inquiries to begin. The decision, though, and I do hope Willie Rennie does understand this point, and I'm sure he will, the decision to hold a fatal accident inquiry, but also the timescale for initiating the inquiry, is a matter entirely for the Lord Advocate. And in this capacity, the Lord Advocate operates independently of government. So it would be wrong, I think, for me to seek to second-guess that decision-making process. Depending upon the circumstances of a case, and I'm not talking about any particular case here, a death investigation can be complex, technical, and it can often involve a number of different agencies. I know the Crown Office is committed to prompt investigations, but I also know that it accepts that in some cases the time taken to complete an investigation has been too long. Finally, the Government has made additional funding available to the Crown Office, and they are using some of that to allow the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit to try to reduce the time required to complete death investigations. I hope that is helpful in the way of an answer, and I hope Willie Rennie is assured that this is an issue that both the Crown Office and the Government take seriously.
Willie Rennie.
I understand that. But how can any lessons be learnt when it takes years to get the answers? It may be that the failure to maintain experienced call handlers in the Bilston Glen Police Service Centre is one of those lessons from the M9 crash. But mistakes are about to be made again at Bilston Glen, alongside other centres in Motherwell and Govan. Police staff on night and back shifts are about to lose thousands of pounds a year in changes to their shift allowances. I am told morale is at rock bottom. We cannot afford to drive experienced call handlers out of the police. So can the First Minister step in to prevent these damaging changes?
First Minister. Well, this is a change that is, of course, still under discussion. The majority of police staff will see an increase, but nevertheless, these are important issues that the Government must properly consider. In terms of the points about fatal accident inquiries, I've answered that as fully as I can, and I won't repeat what I've already said. It is in the interest of everyone that investigations and inquiries take place as quickly as possible, but it is also important that the right processes are followed. We do know that the average number of days to complete fatal accident inquiries is reducing. That's of no comfort to any family who's still waiting for one to start. But these are issues we take seriously and continue to work with the Crown Office to address. And that is the case in terms of the other changes that Willie Rennie has mentioned.
Thank you. For some further supplementaries, the first from Keith Brown.
The First Minister may be aware that the Conservative Party spokesperson on Social Security this morning stated that there is no such thing as the bedroom tax.
Given that the Scottish Government provides an average of £650 in bedroom tax relief for over 70,000 families in Scotland, is the First Minister concerned, as I am, that the Tories would take away this support for families in Scotland because they believe this tax does not even exist?
First Minister.
Well, I am aware, I haven't seen the details myself, but I am aware that Michelle Ballantyne, the Tories Social Security Welfare spokesperson, said at a committee this morning that the bedroom tax does not exist. I think that will come news to the many people that are subject to the bedroom tax, or would be subject to the bedroom tax, but for the mitigation action that this Scottish Government is taking to make sure that nobody in Scotland has to pay the bedroom tax. Perhaps Michelle Ballantyne later on this afternoon will want to explain her comments. I would hope that Jackson Carlow would want to take a very close look at her comments. But it doesn't augur very well if the Tories don't even understand the basics of what people across the country are experiencing in terms of their welfare policies. Then what chance do we have of persuading them to change them? It's an appalling comment if indeed it was made, and I hope Michelle Ballantyne will retract it at the earliest opportunity.
Anas Sarwar to be followed by Lee MacArthur. Anas Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, discrimination is more than just about hate crime. It impacts life chances and outcomes. Today, with the support of SPICE, I published a report which shows that Scotland's diverse minority communities are chronically underrepresented in the civil service and public sector bodies. Only 1.8% of civil servants are from a diverse background. Only 10 of the most senior posts are from a diverse background, and 2/3 of local authorities employ less than 1% from a diverse background. So will the First Minister commit to a full and regular audit of Scotland's public sector? Will she support the implementation of the Rooney Rule, which means that at least one ethnic minority is shortlisted when a vacancy arises? And will she agree to expand the very welcome Gender Representation on Public Boards Act to ensure that our public sector bodies reflect Scottish society?
First Minister.
Well, let me say a couple of things quickly to that. Firstly, I absolutely agree with the sentiments behind Anas Sarwar's question. In terms of the specifics he's asked me there, I will ask the Permanent Secretary to consider all of them, and I will be happy either myself or ask the Permanent Secretary to write to him on how we will take forward all the specific points there. But let me assure him and the entire Chamber that the Scottish Government as an employer is absolutely determined to increase the numbers of ethnic minorities working within the organisation. They are underrepresented in the Scottish Government right now, as will be the case for many organisations and employers. And just as it is important that we redress that imbalance in gender, it is also vital that we do so for ethnic minorities. And the Scottish Government, as an employer, is absolutely committed to doing so and committed to encouraging other employers to take similar action.
Lee MacArthur to be followed by Annie Wells.
Thank you, President Officer. The First Minister will recall that the Saltire Prize for Marine Energy was first launched in 2008 by her predecessor Alex Salmond amid characteristic fanfare. Mr Salmond then went on to relaunch the prize on a regular basis over subsequent years before it was quietly then abandoned, unclaimed in 2017. Given the role that tidal energy needs to play in our future energy mix, as well as in meeting our climate change targets, what assurance can the First Minister give that the latest version of the Saltire Prize is actually winnable and not simply an exercise in window dressing?
First Minister.
Well, actually, I think this is a legitimate question for Liam MacArthur to have raised. The reason that we have recast this prize is to make sure that it matches developments in tidal energy. The Saltire Prize was not doing that. That was nothing to do with the situation when that prize was launched. It's the developments of tidal energy have not developed in a way that people then thought. So we are determined to ensure that this recast initiative helps those who are seeking to develop tidal energy. I, over the last couple of weeks, as I have been promoting Scotland internationally, have spoken to a number of people active in renewable energy, and certainly some of them that I have spoken to were very warmly welcoming of these changes because they thought it better reflected the work that they were doing. So hopefully Liam MacArthur can be reassured by that, and we can all get behind renewable energy generally in Scotland, but tidal energy in particular.
Annie Wells.
Thank you. On Saturday, another shooting took place in Glasgow, in Springburn, the area I live. And this is almost a year after the victim's brother was shot in the same street, in one of the many shootings that have taken place in Glasgow over the last 2 years, something that I have raised in the Chamber before. So can I ask the First Minister what action will be taken to reassure residents that steps are being taken to clamp down on gun crime?
First Minister.
Well, this is primarily, of course, an operational matter for Police Scotland. I know from the discussions I have with Police Scotland that this is an issue. Gun crime and gang-related crime in the city of Glasgow is something that is a real priority for them. For the government's part, we have a duty to support police. That's why we're increasing the revenue budget of Police Scotland to enable them to do the job that they are tasked to do. The Justice Secretary and I are regularly briefed by Police Scotland on developments around serious and organised crime, and this is an issue that I'm sure will continue to be one of great priority, because I think that is required in order to give the kind of reassurance to people living in Glasgow, which is where I live and where my constituency is, and that's an important point to have raised.
Question number 4, Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether she will provide an update on her recent visits to Canada, the United States and France.
First Minister.
Well, in the face of Brexit, it's never been more important to demonstrate that Scotland is an open, outward-looking country and that we're open for business. I visited the US, Canada and France, markets that are worth over £8 billion to Scotland's economy, to promote us as an attractive place to invest, visit, work and live. During my visits, I opened new hubs in Canada and France, part of our programme for government commitments to grow our relationships with other countries, and hosted events to promote Scottish food and drink. I met with companies including Marriott, Accor, Morgan Stanley, IBM and BNP Paribas, all important stakeholders in some of our key economic sectors. I also spoke at an event at the UN, hosted by the Assistant Secretary-General for Human Rights, to discuss Scotland's commitment to gender equality and human rights.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. Does the First Minister agree that by promoting trade and investment and launching new innovation and investment hubs in Ottawa and Paris, the Scottish Government is working to show Scotland as an attractive place to invest, visit, work and live, and that Scotland is building positive international relationships as we are taking out of the European Union against our will? Instead of taking the isolationist view of the parochial Tories who quibble at any attempt by Scotland to raise its profile on the international stage, even as we strive to attract investment and jobs into Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, it's always been important for First Ministers to represent and promote the country abroad. By coincidence, Edinburgh Airport, when I was going to France on Monday, I ran into Jack McConnell, who was reminding me about how important it was when he was First Minister. And it's even more important now because of Brexit. So I make no apology. I will continue to do everything I can to promote Scotland abroad. Interestingly, the Tories have been criticising it. I noticed that the Secretary of State for Scotland actually seems to agree with me rather than with them. In the last couple of years alone, David Mundell has visited Iceland, the USA, Uruguay, Chile, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Japan, Norway, Paraguay, Argentina, Germany, Belgium, Myanmar and Singapore. And do you know what? I back him to do it. I think the only question is, why did nobody notice he was gone?
Question number 5, Jamie Green.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to reports that alterations have been made to ScotRail's satisfaction targets over the last 2 years.
First Minister.
The Government puts the interests of the passenger first, which is why the franchise contract includes requirements to meet passenger satisfaction targets. Only a few rail franchises require this. The Government holds ScotRail to account for matters within the franchisee's control, but it is only reasonable and required contractually that we also take account of impacts beyond the control of the franchisee. The targets for overall satisfaction have been adjusted as required by the contract for 2 reasons. Firstly, to take account of a change in survey methodology by passenger focus, and secondly, to take account of increased disruption levels from extended route closures due to track renewal works in the Queen Street Tunnel and delayed electrification works. The extent and impact of this disruption was not known at the time of the bids for the ScotRail franchise.
Jamie Green.
ScotRail's contractual satisfaction target is 88.5%, but over the past 2 years the Scottish Government dropped these targets to 84% and 85%. And surprise, surprise, the operator met the newly lowered targets and thus avoiding triggering an event of default. We also know that ScotRail is unlikely to meet its PPM performance targets, perhaps for months if not years to come. The First Minister told this chamber in December that services were unacceptable and she apologised to passengers for dismal performance. What message does the First Minister think it sends to any franchise holder that moving the goalposts and lowering the targets is how this government will deal with it not meeting its contractual obligations. And given that satisfaction is at a 15-year low, passengers have had repeated apologies from this government. What is the First Minister's message to passengers today?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, as I said a moment ago, the ScotRail franchise is one of just a very few rail franchises to actually require them to meet passenger satisfaction targets. I think that's a good thing. In terms of amendments or adjustments, I'm not sure if Jamie Green is seriously proposing that ScotRail should be held to account for factors that are outside of its control, factors that are down to the failure of Network Rail, for example, which is not devolved to this Parliament. But thirdly, and finally, Presiding Officer, we do continue to hold ScotRail to account. The results of the National Rail Passenger Survey led to a formal remedial plan notice being issued by Transport Scotland on the 8th of February, requiring them to submit a remedial plan. So we've got robust arrangements in place, and the Scottish Government will do what requires to be done to ensure that ScotRail is held to account against them.
Richard Lyle.
Can the First Minister give an indication of what proportion of any delays are linked to Network Rail? And would the First Minister agree that it's high time that opposition members, MSPs in this Parliament, join in the call for the full devolution of Scotland's railways?
First Minister.
Well, the opposition don't like this, but Richard Lyle's question is absolutely on the money, because the KPI target for overall satisfaction was adjusted to take account of increased disruption caused by the delay to Network Rail's electrification works. The adjustment also took account of the delay to track renewal works in the Queen Street Tunnel. Again, that's the responsibility of Network Rail. These issues are out with ScotRail's control. They are out with the control of the Scottish Parliament, given responsibility for Network Rail is not devolved. And overall, more than half of the delays on the network over the past year have been the responsibility of Network Rail. So if the opposition want us to be able to do more about this, then they need to get behind our calls to devolve Network Rail to this Parliament.
Mike Rumbles.
First Minister, it's no good blaming Network Rail. Half of the problems with Network Rail are down to weather, and they don't change.
The question, please.
We've heard that customer satisfaction rates have dropped to a 15-year low. That's the customer. And performance indicators are still well below the level where financial penalties should have been levelled by this government. And they provide an unacceptable service still. Would the First Minister accept that the public have lost confidence in Abellio as the operator of the £7 billion ScotRail franchise, and the franchise should be ended at the first break point in the contract?
First Minister.
Firstly, ScotRail should be held to account where it fails, and it is held to account. ScotRail is fined where that is appropriate for failures in its performance. Secondly, in terms of the franchise, of course, it's only down to the actions of this government. This was opposed for a long time by the unionist parties in this Parliament, that we now do have the power to ensure a public sector bid for franchises in future. But Mike Rumbles is not seriously suggesting, as I think he was there, that when more than half of the delays on the network are the responsibility of Network Rail, then we shouldn't blame Network Rail. Let's hold ScotRail to account when it's their failures to blame, but let's hold Network Rail to account when it's them to blame. And let's give ourselves the ability to properly hold them to account by devolving responsibility to this Parliament.
Question number 6, Pauline McNeill.
To ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government plans to take to help vulnerable energy consumers.
First Minister.
Well, we're disappointed that the UK Government continually fails to create an energy market that serves consumers fairly, particularly the most vulnerable. As the member knows, fuel costs are the biggest driver of fuel poverty, not one we have power over. Where we do have powers, we're taking action, including bringing forward the Fuel Poverty Bill and our Energy Efficiency Route Map. We're pleased Ofgem's latest findings show that no customers were disconnected in Scotland in 2017, and fewer Scottish customers are repaying energy debts, but I still believe that more should be done. That's why we've recently written to the CEOs of the big 6 energy companies, urging them to build on this and inviting them to engage with us on how we can support more people.
Pauline McNeill.
Almost 1/4 of people are already living in fuel poverty, but on April the 1st, more than 1 million households in Scotland are looking at an average £110 increase a year rise in their bills after the energy watchdog Ofgem increased the cap for those on the default, otherwise known as the variable tariff. It questions whether or not you can argue there's a cap any longer, but the energy companies are supposed to have a priority services register, but there is currently no standard qualifying criteria for a vulnerable household. I'm pleased that the First Minister has said that she has written to the Big Six companies. Will she further pressurise them to ensure that they do have a strategy for vulnerable customers and try to force to take them on the highest tariffs to protect their interests?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I actually agree with Polly McNeill. I agree with her point about the cap. The cap is controlled by the UK government. We don't have control over that. But yes, we will continue to engage with the energy companies to persuade and encourage them to do everything they can to help vulnerable customers, and we'll take whatever other action we can within our power to help vulnerable customers, because the increases that she has referred to are completely and utterly unacceptable.
Question number 7, Ross Greer.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the youth strike for climate.
First Minister.
The threat of climate change can sometimes, I think, seem overwhelming, but I think we should all be optimistic both about Scotland's record in almost halving our emissions and the actions of young people last week. Given the impact climate change will have on young people, it is essential that we listen to them carefully. I'd certainly be happy to meet with the students, and I've asked my officials to work with them to try to facilitate that. The targets proposed in our climate change bill mean Scotland will be carbon neutral by 2050. Last week, the Committee on Climate Change informed us that their next advice on targets will be published on the 2nd of May. If they say that we can now responsibly and credibly set a date to achieve net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases, then we will do so.
Ross Greer.
I thank the First Minister for that answer and for her words of support for the young people who took strike action, both on the day itself and today. But as the First Minister herself has previously acknowledged, we're well beyond the point where words are sufficient to deal with this crisis. The young people that I was with in Glasgow on Friday had one key demand: keep it in the ground. So on their behalf, can I ask the First Minister if she acknowledges, if the Scottish Government acknowledge, the indisputable scientific reality that the overwhelming majority of oil and gas reserves in the North Sea and elsewhere must stay there unburnt?
First Minister.
Well, we certainly understand the importance of the transition from fossil fuels to a carbon-neutral economy, and we support that in so many different ways. At the heart of our proposals, of course, is the concept of just transition, to make sure that workers in one industry are not left behind as we make that transition. And I absolutely hope that all members in this chamber would understand the importance of getting that balance right. But absolutely, in terms of tackling climate change, there is no bigger priority. Scotland is already leading the way, and we want to make sure we continue to do so.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the First Minister's questions. And could I thank the First Minister and most of the contributors for their brevity. We're going to move on to members' business in the name of Jamie Green on delivering sustainable and renewable transportation for Scotland. But we'll just take a few moments. In fact, we'll have a short suspension.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
I
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.